Welcome to Hard Script.
She didn't say it during a fight. There was no raised voice, no slammed door. She said it the way she said everything lately, calm, managerial, like she was assigning shifts. Affection would be planned, put on a shared calendar, reviewed weekly, adjusted if needed. She stood at the kitchen counter in her scrubs, scrolling with one thumb, already moving on to the next task. I was still wearing my jacket from the ambulance bay, the smell of antiseptic and burned coffee clinging to it. I had just come off a stretch where time didn't belong to me. Sirens, compressions, hands shaking back to steady. I hadn't sat down yet. She didn't look up when she said it. She didn't ask if that worked for me. She framed it as a system upgrade, like we'd been running inefficiently. I nodded, not because I agreed, because that's what you do when you understand the rules have already been written. At the hospital, everyone knows me as dependable. I show up when the call comes in. I step into chaos without needing instructions. My wife, Lauren, runs her floor the same way. Senior nurse. Clipboards. Authority that never raises its voice. People move when she enters a room. That night, she added a block on her phone and told me we'd try it for a month. Physical closeness, emotional check-ins, even downtime together, categorized and contained. She kissed my cheek like a stamp of approval and went to shower. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I washed my hands, changed, and watched the calendar sync to my phone. The shift started immediately. I stopped filling the gaps she didn't notice I filled. No more stepping in when her day ran long. No more late-night debriefs at the edge of the bed. When she talked about work, I listened the way I listened to a dispatcher, neutral, efficient, no follow-up questions. At the hospital the next day, I passed her unit and saw her laughing with one of the younger EMTs. Ryan. New uniform, eager posture, always half a step behind her. He looked at her the way people look at oxygen when they've been holding their breath too long. She didn't see me watching. She was busy being the center of gravity. That evening, when she realized I hadn't stayed up, she sent a short message asking if everything was okay. I replied that my availability had changed. I attached no emotion to it. Just the calendar. The first crack didn't come from her. It came from someone who had nothing to gain by telling me anything at all. I was restocking the rig when Mark, one of the senior paramedics, mentioned her name in passing. He said it casually, like weather, like an observation that didn't require a response. He noted how Lauren had been staying later on her floor, how she'd taken an unusual interest in mentoring one of the junior guys. He didn't accuse. He didn't smirk. He simply stated it the way men do when they assume another man already knows. I kept my hands moving. Gloves, gauze, inventory unchanged. Mark added that Ryan had been picking up extra shifts, always on her schedule, always available. He said the kid looked energized, like someone who thought proximity meant promotion. Then Mark shrugged and walked off, already done with the conversation. I didn't confront her. I didn't replay it in my head. I treated the information the way I treat incoming data in the field. Logged. Verified later. At home, the calendar governed everything. She followed it precisely, almost proudly. When a slot opened for connection, she showed up prepared, like she'd checked a box before moving on. When it closed, she returned to her phone, her messages, her quiet authority. I adjusted further. When she forgot her badge one morning and asked if I could swing by the hospital to drop it off, I told her I couldn't. Not because I was busy, because it wasn't on the schedule. I said it evenly, without explanation. She paused, surprised, then said she'd figure it out. She did. Ryan brought it to her. At work, I started staying later, volunteering for extra calls, picking up shifts no one wanted, not to avoid home, but to narrow my presence. When I was there, I was focused. When I wasn't, I was unreachable. Lauren noticed the absence before she noticed the reason. She asked if something was wrong, framing it as concern but watching me closely, like she was checking for a leak in a system she'd designed. I told her everything was running as agreed. The next time I passed her unit, I saw Ryan again. He was leaning in, listening to intently, absorbing every word she gave him. She rested a hand on his arm as she spoke, a gesture so brief it could be denied. She laughed. He did too, a second later. She didn't look toward the hallway. She didn't see me. That was when I understood it wasn't about desire. It was about control. And control only works when someone keeps showing up. I didn't go looking for proof. It came to me the way most things do in a hospital, quietly, through systems that assume no one is paying attention. Lauren left her tablet on the kitchen table one evening, still unlocked, a charge cable trailing across the wood like an afterthought. It wasn't a secret device. It was the one she used for work schedules, patient flow, internal messaging. I wasn't snooping. I was clearing space to eat. A notification slid across the screen. Not a name. An initial. R. It wasn't what it said that mattered. It was how often it appeared. Short messages. Frequent. Always timed around shift changes and late evenings. Nothing graphic. Nothing dramatic. Just consistency. Dependence. A rhythm that didn't belong to me anymore. I didn't open anything. I didn't need to. Patterns tell the truth faster than words. Later that week, I noticed the bank alert on my phone while I was grabbing coffee between calls. A small charge from a place near the hospital. Not unusual on its own. It repeated days later. Same amount. Same location. Not a restaurant she ever mentioned. Not one we'd been to together. I didn't ask. I adjusted. I removed myself from every unscheduled support role she'd grown used to. When her car wouldn't start and she messaged me for help, I responded with the same calm she used on me. I said my day was full and suggested roadside assistance. When she worked a double and came home exhausted, I was already asleep. When she tried to vent, I listened without leaning in, without softening, without offering solutions. At work, I kept my eyes open. I saw Ryan hovering near her station whenever he could, carrying things she didn't ask for, waiting for approval like it was oxygen. She rewarded it with attention, with smiles she no longer practiced at home. I stayed invisible. One afternoon, I was called to her floor for a patient transfer. She didn't expect to see me. Her posture shifted when our eyes met, just slightly, like someone realizing a door they thought was closed had been left ajar. I treated the patient. I acknowledged her professionally. Nothing more. That evening, she checked the calendar and noticed entire sections of my time had gone dark. She asked if I was pulling away. I told her I was aligning my access with the system she'd put in place. She stared at me longer than usual, like she was trying to locate a control panel that had been moved. That was when the balance tipped. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't announce that I was stepping back. I simply stopped being where she expected me to be. It began with small absences. I missed a routine dinner window she had penciled in. Then a morning check-in disappeared. The calendar still existed, but my confirmations didn't arrive. I didn't cancel anything. I just didn't reinforce it. At work, I requested a temporary reassignment. Nothing dramatic. A coverage need on the other side of the city. Fewer overlaps. Fewer chances to cross paths. My phone stayed on, but notifications were filtered. Only emergencies broke through. Everything else waited. Lauren noticed the silence before she understood it. She sent short messages that didn't require answers, then longer ones that pretended they didn't need them. When those went unanswered, she tried calling. I let it ring while I was already moving, already engaged, already elsewhere. From a distance, I watched the effect ripple outward. She started staying later again, not with purpose, but with restlessness. Ryan filled the space immediately. He was always available, always eager. He stepped into the gaps I left, mistaking access for importance. She let him, not because she needed him, but because she needed to feel followed. One evening, she showed up at the apartment unexpectedly, earlier than planned. I wasn't there. She stood alone in a quiet space that had been reset to minimal. No notes. No explanations. Just absence. She called me again. This time, her voice carried something new. Not anger. Uncertainty. I answered hours later, calm and neutral, and told her I'd been tied up. She asked where. I told her I'd been working. She asked why I hadn't told her. I reminded her that updates weren't on the schedule. The next day, her messages shifted tone. Less controlled. More frequent. She asked if I was upset. I told her I wasn't. I told her I was aligned. At the hospital, I heard whispers. Not about her affair. About her stress. About how sharp she'd become. How distracted. Authority falters when attention splits, and people notice when a leader starts scanning the room instead of commanding it. Ryan hovered closer, mistaking her tension for intimacy. He didn't realize he was a placeholder. I didn't block her. I didn't disappear completely. I remained just visible enough to be unreachable. That was the point. Control depends on predictability. I had removed myself from her pattern without confrontation, without explanation, without emotion. And for the first time since she'd introduced the system, she was the one checking the calendar and finding nothing there. Ryan became louder as I became quieter, not in volume, but in presence. He started showing up in places that had never required him before. Volunteer committees, extra trainings, any space where Lauren's attention could land. He confused proximity with value, and she let him, because admiration is easiest to accept when it asks for nothing in return. I didn't interfere directly. I didn't need to. Hospitals run on invisible hierarchies and unspoken boundaries. Everyone knows who belongs where, who decides, who follows. Ryan had crossed that line without realizing it, mistaking her approval for protection. That kind of mistake corrects itself. I stayed focused on my work. I kept my reputation clean and my schedule full. When administrators needed coverage, I said yes. When committees needed a steady presence, I showed up. I didn't talk about my marriage. I didn't talk about Lauren. I became professionally unremarkable in my personal life and extremely reliable everywhere else. People noticed patterns. Ryan started making mistakes. Nothing dangerous. Nothing dramatic. Small lapses. Missed details. Overconfidence. He leaned on Lauren to smooth things over, to reframe, to shield. She tried, but the more she intervened, the more visible the imbalance became. I heard about it secondhand. A supervisor mentioning concerns. A comment about favoritism said just loudly enough to travel. No accusation, just observation. The kind that sticks. Lauren came home tense. Her authority, once effortless, now required explanation. She tried to pull me back in, not emotionally, but operationally. She asked if I could help her think through a staffing issue. I told her I couldn't. I said my bandwidth was allocated elsewhere. She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Ryan, sensing the shift, pushed harder. More messages. Longer check-ins. He mistook instability for intimacy. He didn't see that he was becoming a liability. One afternoon, I passed through her floor again for a handoff. Ryan was there, standing too close, talking too much. When he noticed me, his posture changed. Not aggressive. Defensive. He knew who I was. He knew what I represented. Competence without need. Authority without asking. Lauren watched the exchange. For the first time, she saw the contrast clearly. Not between two men competing, but between someone who had nothing to prove and someone who was trying too hard to matter. That evening, she checked the calendar again and suggested adding time together. Not scheduled affection, just time. I told her I'd review my availability. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Structures don't collapse when attacked. They collapse when the support holding them up quietly steps away. The shift didn't announce itself. It showed up in rooms Lauren used to control without effort. At work, conversations stopped when she approached. Not abruptly, just enough to register. Eyes flicked away a second too late. People still followed instructions, but the energy had changed. Respect had been replaced with evaluation. Authority, once assumed, now required maintenance. Someone had noticed the pattern. Not the affair. The imbalance. A charge nurse questioned a schedule adjustment Lauren made for Ryan. Nothing confrontational. Just a request for clarification in front of others. Lauren explained it smoothly, but explanations linger longer than commands. The room absorbed it. Ryan felt it too. He grew sharper, more performative. He overcorrected, trying to justify his presence. He talked about future certifications, hinted at ambitions that exceeded his current role. It didn't impress anyone. It made him visible in the wrong way. At home, Lauren's composure began to fracture at the edges. She didn't come in loud or angry. She came in unsettled. She checked her phone more often. She asked indirect questions that pretended to be casual. She wanted reassurance without admitting she needed it. She asked if I'd heard anything at work. I told her I hadn't, which was true. I hadn't sought it out. Information travels differently when you don't chase it. She mentioned feeling unsupported. Not emotionally, structurally. She said things felt heavier lately, like she was carrying more than before. She waited for me to counterbalance it the way I always had. I didn't. I told her that systems feel heavier when they're compensating for instability. I said it without emphasis, without accusation. Just an observation. She went quiet. The next day, I heard from Mark again. He mentioned that administration was watching Lauren's unit more closely. Not because of outcomes. Because of optics. Perception matters in institutions built on trust and hierarchy. Lauren didn't know that yet. She only knew that people were less responsive, less forgiving, less willing to smooth things over. Ryan tried to step up. He offered help no one asked for. He stayed late, even when told he could leave. He was always there. And that was the problem. Availability without restraint doesn't read as loyalty. It reads as need. That evening, Lauren asked if I could sit with her. Not talk. Just be there. It wasn't on the calendar. It wasn't framed as affection. It was framed as support. I told her I had a commitment. She nodded, slowly, like she was recalculating something she'd assumed was fixed. For the first time, the isolation she'd engineered wasn't working in her favor. It was turning inward. The isolation didn't arrive as loneliness. It arrived as friction. Lauren began encountering resistance in places that used to open automatically. Requests took longer. Answers came back incomplete. People asked follow-up questions they'd never needed before. Not out of defiance, but out of distance. The kind that forms when certainty erodes. At home, she moved differently. Less efficient. More deliberate. She hovered in doorways instead of passing through them. She lingered when she spoke, like she was waiting for something to meet her halfway. I remained steady. Present, but not available. She tried to restore balance through familiarity. She referenced old routines. Suggested things we used to do without planning. I acknowledged the suggestions without committing to them. I told her I'd let her know. Ryan began to unravel. The more unstable her world became, the harder he leaned in. He mistook proximity for partnership. He didn't see that he was being drawn into the center of a system under scrutiny. His name came up more often, not in praise, in questions. Lauren tried to manage both ends. Authority above, reassurance below. The strain showed. She snapped at a colleague over something minor. She corrected Ryan sharply in front of others, then tried to soften it after. It only made the contrast worse. At work, I crossed paths with her less often, but when I did, the difference was visible. Her confidence was intact, but no longer effortless. Mine required nothing from her. One evening, she asked me directly if I was pulling away from the marriage. I told her I wasn't pulling away. I told her I was maintaining boundaries that had been clarified. She said this wasn't what she meant when she suggested structure. I told her structure works both ways. She didn't argue. She just looked at me, searching for something familiar and not finding it. Later, she stayed up alone. I knew because the lights were still on when I left early. I didn't comment on it. I didn't check in. I didn't adjust. Ryan sent her messages, she didn't answer. When she did, the responses were brief. The dynamic had shifted. He felt it. He tried to reassert relevance. It only emphasized how little control he had. Lauren stood between two losses she didn't know how to name. One was happening publicly, the other quietly at home. She had scheduled access to affection. She hadn't considered what would happen if access to me became conditional too. For the first time, she was surrounded by people and unsupported by all of them. And I was no longer the place she could retreat to. The confrontation didn't arrive with raised voices or accusations. It came quietly, the way final conversations usually do, when escalation has already failed. Lauren waited for me in the living room one evening. Not positioned defensively, not theatrically, just seated, hands folded, posture controlled but strained. She had already tried indirect routes. This was the last one she had left. She said she needed to understand what was happening. Not at work. At home. I didn't sit down right away. I set my bag aside, washed my hands, moved with the same deliberate pace I used after a long call. When I finally faced her, I stayed standing. Not to dominate the space, but because I had no intention of settling into it. She asked when I decided to shut her out. I told her I hadn't shut her out. I told her I'd accepted the terms she introduced and applied them consistently. I reminded her that access, once scheduled, becomes conditional. I said it calmly, like a clarification, not a defense. She said that wasn't fair. That marriage wasn't supposed to work that way. I told her systems don't break because they're unfair. They break because they're misused. She brought up Ryan without saying his name. She framed it as a misunderstanding, a professional boundary that had blurred under pressure. She said nothing had meaning beyond convenience and support. I didn't respond to that. I didn't need to. Explanations offered too late function as noise, not truth. She stepped closer, searching my face for something reactive. Anger, hurt, anything she could engage with. There was nothing there for her to hold. She asked if I still cared. I told her I cared enough not to argue. I told her I cared enough not to compete with a situation that required me to be smaller to fit inside it. That was when her composure finally slipped. Not dramatically, just enough. Her voice tightened. Her control wavered. She said she felt like she was losing everything at once. I told her loss feels sudden when control has masked it for a long time. She asked what I wanted. I told her I wasn't asking for anything. I told her I'd already reorganized my life around clarity, not availability. I said if she needed something from me, it would have to exist outside the framework she'd built to manage access. She stood there, realizing this wasn't a negotiation. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't fighting. I wasn't offering reassurance. I had already stepped out of the role she was confronting me from. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was final in a way that didn't need confirmation. For the first time, she understood that I wasn't withdrawing to punish her. I was no longer participating. The collapse didn't announce itself with scandal. It unfolded through absence and exposure. At work, the questions became formal. Not accusatory, just procedural. Scheduling reviews. Performance metrics revisited. Ryan's name appeared too often in contexts it shouldn't have. His errors were no longer absorbed by the system. They were documented. His availability, once praised, started to look like overreach. Lauren lost her buffer. She tried to correct course by tightening control, but control only works when people believe in it. Her floor grew quieter around her. Not hostile. Careful. Careful enough to signal distance. Ryan reacted poorly. He tried to secure relevance the only way he knew how, by increasing visibility. He spoke out of turn. He volunteered opinions no one asked for. He assumed alignment where there was none. The admiration he once offered her became expectation, then resentment when it wasn't returned. She cut him loose abruptly, professionally, cleanly. But detachment doesn't erase perception. It sharpens it. The shift didn't go unnoticed. At home, the atmosphere thinned. She moved through the apartment like it was temporary housing. She tried to reclaim routines that no longer existed. She waited for me to notice her strain. I did. I didn't respond to it. One evening, she came back looking smaller. Not physically, structurally. Her phone stayed face down. Her voice lacked cadence. She didn't ask for affection. She asked if I could stay. I told her I was heading out. She asked where. I told her I had plans. She nodded once. The kind of nod that accepts loss without understanding it. I was already living differently. My time was filled. My energy was directed. I had become selective in ways that didn't require explanation. Her unraveling existed parallel to my stability, not inside it. Later, I heard what had happened through others. Ryan had been reassigned. Quietly. Effectively removed from her orbit. The story circulating wasn't about an affair. It was about judgment. About favoritism. About a leader who'd blurred lines and paid for it socially, not officially. Lauren's status didn't collapse completely. It fractured. And fractures are harder to hide. She came home to an empty apartment more often. She checked the calendar out of habit, not expectation. She sent messages she didn't need answered anymore, just to confirm there was still a line. There was. But it no longer led to her. I didn't watch her fall. I didn't need to. The distance ensured I felt nothing pull at me when it happened. She had built a system to control access. She hadn't considered what would happen when she lost it. The end didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as clarity. Lauren stopped trying to fix things. Not because she didn't care, but because she finally understood there was nothing left to manage. No levers. No schedule adjustments. No conversations that could reposition her where she'd been. She came home one evening and didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the quiet and waited. Not for reassurance. For acknowledgement. I arrived later, calm, grounded, unchanged. I didn't ask why she was sitting there. I didn't ask what she needed. I set my things down and moved through the space like it belonged to me again. She looked up and asked if this was it. I didn't answer right away. I took a moment, not to think, but to ensure the moment stayed clean. No emotion attached. No finality dramatized. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I told her I'd simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. The explanations had already exhausted themselves. What remained was recognition, sharp and late. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd relied on my presence until it was gone. She said she thought structure would make things safer, easier to control. I told her safety built on control collapses when the other person stops volunteering themselves to be managed. She asked if there was any way back. I told her there was a way forward. Not back. I told her I wasn't offering availability. I was offering terms. Mutual. Unscheduled. Unmanaged. I said if she wanted access to me now, it would exist outside calendars and leverage. It would require respect without oversight. She nodded slowly. Not in agreement. In understanding. Nothing was promised. Nothing was forgiven in that moment. But something had shifted into alignment. I didn't move toward her. I didn't touch her. I didn't stay to anchor her back into balance. I went to the other room and closed the door. That was the boundary. The next morning, I left early. Not to escape. To live. My phone stayed silent. The calendar stayed empty. My life stayed full. Whether she followed or not was no longer something I tracked. I had limited my access to her life quietly, methodically, without punishment or performance. What remained was choice. On both sides. And this time, it wasn't scheduled. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.